Good evening and welcome. President-elect Donald Trump's efforts to fill key roles in his new administration hit a big setback today when his embattled choice to become the next Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, withdrew his name from consideration. Gaetz, who immediately resigned his congressional seat after learning of his selection last week, posted on X today that his confirmation was unfairly becoming a distraction. Gaetz' chances of confirmation by the Senate have been on rocky ground almost from the start over allegations of illicit drug use and sex with a 17-year-old. Gaetz denies all the accusations, which were the subjects of a now closed House ethics investigation. Tonight, President-elect Trump predicting Gaetz has a wonderful future. Gabe Gutierrez leads off our coverage.
Tonight, President-elect Trump's embattled pick for Attorney General is out. Former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz rocking Washington by withdrawing his name. Posting on social media, it is clear that my confirmation was unfairly becoming a distraction to the critical work of the Trump-Vance transition. On Capitol Hill, some Democrats rolling their eyes.
Holy sh**, I didn't see that coming.
While some Republicans seeming relieved. Are you surprised that Gaetz dropped out today?
I was surprised by how abruptly it happened.
Two Trump transition sources with direct knowledge of Gaetz' decision tell NBC News that he notified the president-elect earlier today and that it was Gaetz' call. Another source close to Trump says that Gaetz' withdrawal was welcomed by the transition team, adding that the House ethics report started to leak out and there was no way for Matt to make it. Today, President-elect Trump posting, "I greatly appreciate the recent efforts of Matt Gaetz in seeking approval to be Attorney General. He was doing very well, but at the same time did not want to be a distraction for the administration, for which he has much respect." The sudden withdrawal comes just a day after Vice President-elect J.D. Vance accompanied Gaetz to Capitol Hill, sitting for closed-door meetings with GOP senators.
Senators have been giving me a lot of good advice. I'm looking forward to a hearing. Folks have been very supportive.
But pressure has been building on Gaetz for days.
How troubling were the allegations against Gaetz?
I think very troubling.
A growing number of Republican senators were demanding the release of a House ethics report into allegations he paid women for sex, including a 17-year-old, back in 2017. Just today, a source familiar telling NBC News there was allegedly a second sexual encounter with the 17-year-old that included another woman. Gaetz has repeatedly denied the accusations, and a Justice Department investigation into similar allegations ended, with prosecutors filing no charges against Gaetz. Tonight, multiple sources tell NBC News at least 5 Republican senators were prepared to vote against Gaetz' confirmation, and he could only afford to lose 3 GOP votes.
Matt Gaetz.
All of this a blow to Trump, who had been looking for someone to shake up the Justice Department, which he blames for launching what he calls partisan prosecutions against him. Just days ago saying he had no second thoughts about the pick.
Are you reconsidering the nomination of Matt Gaetz?
No.
Tonight, it's not clear what's next for Gaetz or his political career.
Apparently, he was aware of reality.
And Gabe, we have just learned who President-elect Trump is naming to replace Gaetz.
Yes, Lester, just moments ago, the president-elect posted on social media that he plans to nominate former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi as his next Attorney General.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez at the Capitol, thank you. And Trump's pick for Defense Secretary is under new scrutiny tonight after a police report reveals the details of a sexual assault allegation against Pete Hegseth, who denies wrongdoing and no charges were filed. Ryan Nobles has more on Hegseth's trip to Capitol Hill.
Tonight, President-elect Trump's pick for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth defending himself after a potential new hurdle in his confirmation fight. NBC News obtaining a police report detailing a woman's allegation he sexually assaulted her.
Did you sexually assault a woman in Monterey, California?
I'll keep it very simple. The matter was fully investigated, and I was completely cleared, and that's where I'm leaving.
According to the police report, the woman says she met Hegseth at a hotel where he was speaking in 2017, saying at one point she blacked out, alleging he took her phone and blocked her attempt to leave the room, and said that she remembered saying no a lot. Police investigated and did not file any charges against Hegseth. He said the encounter was consensual. His attorney said Hegseth later paid her to keep her from going public, so his career would not be hurt, and saying Mr. Hegseth is innocent. It was fully investigated by police, and video surveillance, as well as multiple eyewitness statements, show that she was the aggressor. Hegseth today on Capitol Hill with Vice President-elect Vance, meeting with Republican senators who will decide if he gets the job.
Senator, did you talk to him about the sexual assault allegations?
It's a disgrace that those allegations are nothing but what you said, allegations that are he said, she said. This is a case that has been dismissed.
So are you concerned at all that he did pay her to keep her story quiet?
I don't know the circumstances behind it. I think all those will come out, but I believe his story.
Hegseth is a former Fox News host and decorated combat veteran, but his lack of government experience raising questions among some GOP senators over his qualifications to run the largest federal government agency.
There needs to be legitimate vetting. When I say legitimate, I mean just thorough vetting that the committees do. This is our job.
Two other Trump picks facing new backlash. Tulsi Gabbard, the former Democratic congresswoman and military veteran, picked as the director of national intelligence, slammed by Nikki Haley overnight.
This is not a place for a Russian, Iranian, Syrian, Chinese sympathizer.
A Trump transition spokesperson responding that Tulsi Gabbard is a combat veteran who saw devastation caused by wars championed by people like Nikki Haley. And tonight there's newly revealed audio of Health and Human Services pick Robert F. Kennedy Jr. criticizing Trump supporters 8 years ago.
The way that you build a truly vicious nationalist movement is to wed a relatively small core of belligerent idiots.
RFK Jr. saying, I no longer hold this belief, and I now regret having made those statements.
Ryan, let me back up to Pete Hegseth. Any indications how his meetings there went today?
Yeah, Lester, Hegseth does not appear to be in the same situation as Matt Gaetz, who was forced to withdraw. The Republican senators who met with him believe that he has a path to confirmation. And even though there are some skeptical people in the GOP ranks, there is not a single Republican senator that has come forward to say they will not support him. Lester?
Ryan Nobles tonight. Thank you.
All right, got to get to some breaking news now into us. You know, at the top of the show, we told you how there was this question mark of who Donald Trump, the president-elect, would name as his next pick to lead the Justice Department. Turns out we now know. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, that is who he has chosen in literally like the last 95 seconds here. She would, of course, replace Matt Gaetz in that process moving forward. Gaetz took his name out of the running earlier today. Vaughn Hilliard is joining us now. Boy, this moved fast, Vaughn. Right? I mean, it's literally just been hours since Gaetz, I mean, in the course of the last 24 hours, Vaughn Hilliard, Gaetz was on Capitol Hill trying to get senators to back him. Then he withdrew his name. Now, another, I think fair to say, absolutely Trump loyalist, somebody else who is part of the MAGA movement, somebody who's considered a conservative firebrand, is Mr. Trump's pick now to serve as the head of the Justice Department.
Right. We just talked a few moments ago, and I'll admit I was about a block down the road, and somebody shouted out.
Thanks for turning around and coming back, friend.
The name Pam. Somebody said the name Pam Bondi, and my response was, for what? And I say that not of any disrespect for Pam Bondi, the longtime Attorney General of Florida from 2011 to 2019, but because Donald Trump really is not telegraphing his picks in a very public way. These are picks, much like Matt Gaetz came as a surprise. Pam Bondi was not a name that we have conversed about over the last hours since Matt Gaetz took his name out of the running. That said, Pam Bondi, as you noted, has been a longtime ally of the former president and now president-elect. When you were covering that White House, you know that Pam Bondi was a presence often there helping defend him during his impeachment proceedings. She left as AG in 2019. She was somebody that became a frequent presence on Fox and other right-wing cable outlets to defend Donald Trump. And now you fast forward to the year of 2024, Pam Bondi is now the latest nominee of Donald Trump to be the next Attorney General of the United States.
The question's going to be, okay, can she get Senate confirmed, right? Can she make it through the Senate process? And I will note, guess what? Our Hill reporters are now jumping into action, asking senators this very question as of about 90 seconds ago. So the answer is really, we don't know yet. It's going to be a question mark as to how these Senate Republicans feel. What we can, I think, say is that that Matt Gaetz was an explosive choice for AG, right? Which is why I think you saw some of that almost immediate pushback from Senate Republicans. I think there's a question mark as to whether Bondi is going to be quite as much of a political grenade, if you will.
Right. And honestly, Hallie, I think we'll have to go back and listen to some of her interviews over these last years and the extent to which she has talked about the Department of Justice. Of course, for Matt Gaetz, everybody knew that he, with quite the bombast, would talk about rooting out the deep state, the supposed D state inside the Department of Justice, and that career prosecutors were going to need to be fired. And frankly, this announcement came in just the last few minutes. And Pam Bondi has been a surrogate for Donald Trump. She's been a big booster of his. But I think that this is going to be why the confirmation proceedings and hearings take place, because I'm sure undoubtedly that a lot of senators who will absolutely know who Pam Bondi is. They know that she served here in California or in Florida for 8 years as Attorney General, but undoubtedly there's going to be a lot of questions about her past and her positions and what she wants to do with the Department of Justice that will undoubtedly face scrutiny up on Capitol Hill, understanding that Donald Trump made the commitment to pick loyalists and allies for the second administration. And nobody I have ever heard of questioned Pam Bondi and her loyalty to Donald Trump.
For more on Gaetz's withdrawal and taking his bid to be Attorney General out of the picture and the woman that has now been picked to replace him, let's bring in a Republican who called for the release of that House ethics report on Gaetz. Charlie Dent is a former representative for Pennsylvania's 15th congressional district, and he served as the chair of the House Ethics Committee in the past. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us on a really busy news day. Before we get into some of the discussions and questions about that report and the House Ethics Committees, what they will do now, let's just get your reaction to what we have learned this evening with the selection of Pam Bondi as the next Attorney General. Is that someone that you think is a better pick here?
Well, certainly she's a better pick than Matt Gaetz. I mean, she's not going to have the character questions, and she's clearly got experience as a prosecutor, served even before she was Attorney General. You know, her challenge, of course, will be she's very loyal to President-elect Trump, and there'll be questions about her role perhaps in the impeachment and on the 2020 election. So she'll have to answer for that, and so certainly she'll have to also answer you know, about questions about retribution. Will she carry out Donald Trump's intention to, you know, torch the Justice Department and go after his political enemies? But that said, you know, she's certainly a much better candidate than Matt Gaetz and has a much better chance of confirmation than Matt Gaetz ever did. His nomination, of course, crashed at takeoff.
So, yeah, earlier this week, you penned an MSNBC op-ed with the headline, "Don't Let Matt Gaetz Escape Accountability." And you wrote in part this, quote, "When members of Congress resign because of scandal, they usually leave quietly and go about the task of quietly rebuilding their lives, relationships, and reputations. They don't get nominated for U.S. Attorney General." You went on to say there's a compelling case for the release of the Ethics Committee report on Gaetz. The Senate is demanding to see the report as part of its official record and constitutional duty to advise and consent. We often hear people rightly remind officials on Capitol Hill, average citizens, you work for us, right? There's still, regardless of what has happened with Gaetz, a argument to be made that the public has a right to know more about what is in this report, because we don't know what Gaetz is going to do from here. Do you still believe that the House Ethics Committee should make this report public so that people can have a look at it, regardless of Gaetz's appointment or withdrawal for Attorney General?
Well, Gaetz's withdrawal has taken a little bit of pressure off the Ethics Committee, but we should remember that there have been other cases of allegations of sexual misconduct where reports or statements were released by the committee after the member departed Congress. As you may remember, there was Mark Foley back in 2006 who had sent inappropriate text messages to pages. And after he resigned, there were members of Congress who were sitting members who were deposed to answer questions about what they might have known about that situation. More recently, Blake Farenthold, a congressman from Texas in 2018, after he resigned, the committee made a statement about it was a sexual harassment case, and then there was some kind of a settlement associated with it. Back in 1990, there was a case of a congressman on allegations of having sex with a 16-year-old. He resigned, and a report was released after he left Congress. So in these cases of allegations of sexual misconduct, there has been greater pressure on the committee to release these reports. And in the case of Matt Gaetz, you know, I thought, you know, of course, he's going to be Attorney General. The public does have a right to know in the Senate. But I suspect there's still going to be a strong case to be made to release the report.
Let me ask you a question. Kind of my question to you is, can you explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old? But in terms of just logistics and the way things work on the Hill, what could happen with Matt Gaetz next? Is there a window where he can say, oh, I resigned, never mind, I'm unresigning? Could we see him launch another campaign, or could he be appointed for the Senate? I mean, what are the possible avenues where we could see or could we see Matt Gaetz back on the Hill and soon?
Well, his resignation letter was read across the desk or on the floor of the House of Representatives, and it said he was resigning for this current Congress, which ends in a few weeks. And then he also said it was his intent not to serve in the next Congress. So what does that mean, his intent? So I guess conceivably, he could still try to be sworn in for the next Congress. Of course, the Ethics Committee would still retain jurisdiction then, and would certainly release the report if he stayed. Now, obviously, the Trump administration might want to put him in a position that does not require confirmation by the Senate. I think that would be very. I think that would be very controversial, and of course, that would also cause more cries to release the report if he's going to continue in serving the public in some way. And by the way, this issue about releasing reports, there is no rule. There is no rule that prohibits the committee from releasing these reports. It's only been a tradition or a custom or, frankly, a courtesy to resigning members that reports not be released. That has been the case because, again, most of them go quietly and nobody really wants to pile on. But this is a different case. It's quite exceptional.
All right. Really interesting insight. Charlie Dent, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. For more on Trump's transition and the bumpy start to his cabinet selection, let's bring in our panel. Robert Bluey, the Daily Signal president and executive editor, and Antoine Seawright, a Democratic strategist. Robert, let me start with you, and if we can, let's just pick up where Ryan Nobles and I left off there and around this discussion about Pete Hegseth for defense secretary. I want to play some sound that we have from a Republican North Dakota senator, Robert Kramer. This is what he had to say about Hegseth.
To the sexual assault report, this allegation, does that give you any pause with that?
Well, it's a pretty big problem given that we have a sexual assault problem in our military.
All right, so Senator Kevin Kramer there is seeming to express that he does have some concerns. I'm curious, Robert, what do you make of his point?
Well, ultimately, Ellison, I think that Pete Hegseth will win confirmation, as the senators you saw there saying they want to scrutinize his record and these recent allegations. But at the end of the day, I think there's something more going on here with Pete Hegseth, and that's the fact that he doesn't come from the military-industrial complex. He didn't get his credentials from Raytheon or General Dynamics and other places that so much drive policy at the Pentagon. And frankly, he wants to shake things up. So I am not surprised that some of the establishment in Washington, D.C. are taking issue with him. That being said, we should hear him out at the confirmation hearings and let this play out as they normally do.
Antoine, what do you make of it?
Well, my Republican friends often will say publicly that we should run government like a business. And most of these nominees, if they were interviewing, forget about interviewing, they would not even qualify for an interview to even have a chance of having any of these roles based on not just their merit and their skill set, but some of the clouds, the dark clouds that follow around them. And I think we should all take that to note. At the end of the day, what I think this represents is the Trump administration, income administration, grading their own homework and making assumptions just because they won the election. That means they're going to get their way politically, and I don't think that's going to be the case. There's always a process when it comes to the nominees, and this deep, dark history that some of these nominees have will see the light of day because the process is in place, and the process will not be removed regardless of the politics.
Okay, Robert, let's shift to the Attorney General news. I feel like we're just like ping-ponging between so many topics, so I apologize for being scattered here. But shifting to Attorney General news, we'll talk about Matt Gaetz, but if we can, Robert, let's start with Pam Bondi. This is the former Florida Attorney General. As we mentioned earlier, she was part of Donald Trump's impeachment defense team at his first impeachment trial. She is someone who spoke, if I'm not mistaken, at the RNC convention in 2016 and then again in 2020. She's frequently been on TV. She's someone that I think is very clearly well known in conservative circles and someone Donald Trump has had a relationship with for quite a while. And she's been, for everything we can see publicly, a strong ally and supporter of Donald Trump. Why do you think Trump didn't just go with her first? Because objectively on paper, regardless of any controversies or political opinions people may have, legally, she has a lot more qualifications than Matt Gaetz had on the legal front. Why not start with Pam Bondi instead of Matt Gaetz when it seemed obvious from the outset that he was going to be a difficult pick to get through the Senate?
Well, let's remember that Matt Gaetz has a history in his time in Congress of going after the Department of Justice, specifically on the issue that Donald Trump cares about most, and that's removing the weaponized attorney general and replacing that with a person who's going to follow the rule of law. And so Matt Gaetz's record was quite clear on that, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that he decided to move in that direction. As for Pam Bondi, I mean, remember, Pam Bondi also was a prosecutor. She spent 2 terms as Florida's attorney general, and then Trump picked her to serve on a task force to work on the opioid epidemic. So she has quite a whole list of experience that I think will serve her well in this position. And I do think, as the congressman said in the previous segment, that she will stand a much easier path to confirmation.
Antoine, what do you think about the selection of Pam Bondi? And if we can go back to Matt Gaetz first, were you surprised that after everything we saw yesterday, all of the push and the efforts made on Capitol Hill, that Gaetz made the decision to step aside?
I was not surprised at all, because politics is a game of addition and multiplication, not subtraction of the and division. And as we say in my neighborhood, the math simply was not mathing for Matt Gaetz. On top of, we knew that there was going to be more exposure into some of the challenges in his background as the days and weeks to come as we move through this confirmation process. So I was not surprised at all. He became, the 7th quickest nomination to be snatched from the process in the history of this country. And so as we shift to Pam Bondi, and another election denier, some would argue insurrection supporter, someone who's now a registered lobbyist, someone who was paid $25,000 by way of a donation in 2013, and as a result of that, many would argue that she did not prosecute a civil case against Trump University when she had the opportunity. So we know that she's a loyal character to the former president. That's the first pledge of allegiance for all of his nominees. And so the process may be easier for her than Gaetz. However, I do think there will be some exposure about her record and her background, and that's what the process is all about.
Right. Yeah, she made some claims about fake ballots coming in late back in 2020 in an interview on Fox News. Certainly things that will come up in a Senate confirmation hearing. But as Gabe Gutierrez reported, some of his sources saying that in a lot of ways she is very similar to Matt Gaetz, but doesn't have any allegations related to sexual assault. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time tonight. I wish we had more time. I have so many questions, but we'll do this again, I imagine, in the very near future. Thank you both. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Allison.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.